Today I'm going to walk through an experimental text editor called Span, part of the Constraint Systems collection of projects, which is a bunch of experimental creative apps interested in exploring alternative interfaces for creating images, editing text, creating text, writing text. This is the Constraint Systems homepage, which shows there's right now 16 of these apps that I've made. And let's take a look at Span, so you can preview all these apps in like recorded GIF form. That's it moving around. And then you can also launch them and try them yourself. So what does Span do? It lets you move the cursor, is that blue rectangle that I'm moving around with the keyboard keys. And then you can select sort of these spans, these text areas, and you can move them around. If you run them into stuff, they kind of make sure they fit. And you can adjust the size, and it does this layout. It wraps the text according to how you sized it, and then also to edit the actual text. That's theme changing. You can go into this text box itself, and you can't see that because it's the end, but there it is. Hello, this is Grant. And depending on how you lay out the text, mainly it just respects line breaks in the text inputs. It will make sure that goes to a different span, but otherwise it wraps it. Zoom out a little bit. Why does this exist? So constraint systems, generally I've done experiments that are related to images like stamp, and then I also try text. Text has always been a little more difficult. Face is one where you can edit the characters and see the changes in the font immediately. You can also edit the text. Mix is kind of a mix. It's a binary thing. But in some ways, span hex was one of the first constraint systems thing I did, where you can draw on this grid and you can draw different lines within a grid. And sort of span came out of thinking about eventually adding text into hex and trying to figure out a way to add it in that really fit together with the feel of the rest of the app. So a lot of drawing apps, to make a text area, you kind of click and drag, and then the text can go in there and it wraps at the end of that drag. Let's go back to span. And if your text overflows the text area, like, it usually lets you know that it overflowed and you need to figure out a way to move it or resize it. So I wanted to do something sort of more granular. I'm really interested in keyboard controls, and also like hex and some of the other ones, you can get into a rhythm of like down line, cross. I always thought about, even though I don't know much about it, something like making beats on an MPC, where people go, and wanted to maybe get some of that flow feeling in the keyboard, from the keyboard controls. All that's to say that like drawing a text area seemed possible, but it really, like, you have to plan in this way that like you try and make it the right size and then you try and readjust it, and it doesn't feel very flow like, and also it just isn't made up of like small parts. So span was an attempt to see like, what if we think about this a little differently? It's also just getting text on a grid. So a little bit of figuring it out was just getting the sizing right and getting a font. This is JetBrains Mono, and it's fits in 8 by 16 cells, which is sort of the grid size I tend to use is 8 by 8 or 16 by 16. I had to find the right size, which turns out to be like 13.333. Gets you an 8 pixel wide character, and then putting that line height of 16, you get stuff that fits in. And once you have stuff that fits in, it just opens up a lot of possibilities as you're doing movement and stuff. Um, you can do what you need to do. It's more dependable. You know kind of how it works, how it's going to fit. You can imagine. Okay, one character is going to fit in there. It would have to be a one character word, which there's not in this, but um, you can understand how gaps, and it also makes your code kind of simpler or more understandable to be dealing with those sort of whole numbers, whole that you know what they're going to be. So that was one part of the battle, and then the movement itself. So also all this stuff is inspired by Vim, which is a text editor itself. But doing this stuff really got deep into thinking about what text is. Text is very strange in terms of layout. And thought about it's a Frank Cumero quote that like the interplay between text and images is like the dilemma of web design, and it's sort of related to flow. So an image is two dimensions. It's a grid of pixels, and you can resize the image, but probably you want to keep its aspect ratio, although sometimes I have some experiments in here that don't. Um, Text is different. It's actually one dimensional. Um, and then text wrapping, which we take for granted, although you stop doing that if you have to implement it in your HTML canvas element. Um, Text wrapping gets you that two dimensions. And then there's obviously more formatting, like formatting into a paragraph sort of depends on two dimensions as well. And so it's this weird mix. But if you make a text layout narrower, the expectation is that the text wrap will happen, and it's not a fixed aspect in the same way that an image is a fixed aspect. And that makes it weird to put them next to each other. Um, so I thought about that. But the way span works, which is, and I should also create some spans, let's do that, is that you can create spans by pressing enter, and that gets you this line, and by default it goes to the edge. You can press shift to get it to go the other direction, but let's do some of these. So like I was saying, this kind of, I'm going like J enter, J enter, J enter, and it's kind of flowy. Um, and then if I flow these backwards, um, so it's going line by line, and if it needs to wrap, it will wrap on that line and just push it off to the next one. And if there's a line break in the text box itself, then it respects that line break in terms of moving it on to the next span. And then you can select and move these so you kind of see your layout. You can select these and then resize, and you get that flow, which can be tough because you kind of have to respect the flow. If you're going to resize at the beginning, then you have to realize it could disrupt layout stuff you've done at the top. But that's the way it is. You can adjust for that a little bit with the line breaks. You can kind of work through and get something there. Yeah, you can move around, and then there was some work to get this movement working and decide on the logic for this. So it'll try and wrap, but if there's an instance where one can't fit at all, then it stops because it's going to be a problem. I would have to make a lot of layout code decisions to do that. Um, and you can move around. You can resize. See if I have anything. What else we have? Backspace. You can delete all these spans. You can change themes. So this is kind of a late thing, but I wanted to give some flexibility. For a long time I just had it as the base like text block, but I did want to show the connections a little bit so that it's connected. There's just a lighter theme of the connections, and here's a gradient that goes by order, which is kind of fun. And so there's a lot of limitations in here. It's kind of note card sized. Um, and I wanted to do that because being able to edit the size of the layout itself would be a whole new deal. This is one of the more involved coding projects, sort of because text is weird and there is a lot of movement logic. Um, and I don't know, you just have to keep it track of a lot more stuff than pixels and images. Um, so I always try and build some limitations in to make it sort of doable. Let's start anew. Um, but it's note card sized. And for a long time, I thought this would have multiple texts. I just got rid of the help. But multiple texts you could switch through and then kind of lay out beside each other. And that there would be different colors to show the different texts, and you could interweave the text in interesting ways. Um, and that was cool, but ended up just for this one eliminating that complexity for now. You could sort of still do the same thing if you use line breaks and write different texts. Um, yeah, so that's an outline of the features. I don't know if I should. Um, I'll quickly paste in some text so we have some other text. Like if it's not obvious, you can bring your own text to that. And I remember there's like post secret that was postcards. I kind of hoped people would maybe make weird emotional um, images with this, but that hasn't really happened. Ooh, it's a little harder to edit in that theme. Um, moving them around, you could put like really dramatic narrative next to it, and it is kind of fun. I'm distracted doing this, but to uh, pick out sentences or words and find a good layout for them. There's a gallery that I kind of broke the layout of, but let me see what I made with this. It's like a song album, and kind of taking the phrases and splitting them up. Yeah, that was kind of fun. Which kind of leads me into the overall evaluation of Span and whether I think it was successful. I mean, it was a successful experiment. I think of the constraint system stuff, there's definitely more of a learning curve to making it work. And um, compared to some of the image stuff, it doesn't give you like immediate cool results. But the way I think of it is it was a good step towards figuring out some of this image editor stuff. Just getting my head around line wrapping and really like a lot of these I try and uses ways to really get myself, there's understanding on a theoretical level, and then there's like really kind of experiencing it and sitting with it and coding against it, and getting really comfortable with the ideas, really internalizing them as probably a mental model. And I think this got me a lot closer to understanding text. So I think it was a worthwhile step towards that. And I don't know, I think it's cool. Um, I don't know of that many experimental text layout stuff. I guess it's often built into image systems, but like Figma, which does a lot of interesting stuff, you're drawing text boxes in there, and even like the web model is sort of text box based. So I think there should be more experimentation, and I'm glad I did that. Although like sometimes a lack of experimentation means like if what's there is what makes sense to people. But I don't know. I do not think I've solved this, but I also do not find laying out in text boxes like a very rewarding or like flow like activity. Um, so I'm gonna keep pushing it. Let me think about constraint systems wise. Um, yeah, I've mainly been on images since then, images and pixels. That was the main text one besides face. So I think it's probably time to return. Yeah, I need to think more about it. It is daunting because, like, if you put some of this stuff within also something like Hex, or, I mean, someday I'd like to make a combined drawing app, image editor, and text editor. And currently I'm thinking maybe that'd be a good layout for comics. Um, and it's definitely like, as far as experiments I've done, the text layout is the most intense and involved of that. So I need to find ways to simplify that. Or like if they all fit together well, then everything feels simpler. And I think this was a step towards that, but it's not all the way there. So that's my thinking behind span, and how it fits into this stuff. And thanks for watching. I'd love any contact about these ideas. Um, I feel like there's lots of interesting experiments in writing apps right now, although it's more like sort of content based than layout based. Um, all right, check out Constraint Systems is the homepage, and then you can get all the apps from there.